The United Airlines Boeing 747 sat on the tarmac of San Francisco International Airport, its four colossal engines humming with raw power. The night sky stretched above like a vast abyss, a few scattered stars barely visible beyond the glare of the runway lights. Inside the cockpit, Captain Daniel Reeves ran through the last of his checklists, his experienced hands moving with practiced precision. Beside him, First Officer Mark Sullivan adjusted the throttle levers slightly, his face a mask of concentration. The two had flown together for years, but tonight's flight, United 262, was different. Packed with passengers bound for Sydney, the aircraft carried nearly full fuel tanks and a heavy cargo load. United 262, cleared for takeoff, runway 28R, came the air traffic controller's calm voice over the radio. Cleared for takeoff, 28R, United 262, Reeves confirmed, his voice steady. With a firm push on the throttles, the engines roared to full power. The beast surged forward, gaining speed down the illuminated runway. Passengers felt the familiar pressure against their backs as the 747 gathered momentum, its massive fuselage trembling slightly with the force of acceleration. V1, Sullivan, called out, the speed beyond which takeoff could no longer be safely aborted. Rotate, he followed, and Reeves pulled back on the control yoke. The nose lifted, the aircraft breaking its bond with the earth. The wheels parted from the tarmac, the ground shrinking beneath them as the Boeing 747 began its climb. Everything seemed routine, until it wasn't, a deadly surge. The first warning was subtle. A slight vibration beneath their feet, something that felt out of sync with the usual rhythm of takeoff. It was the kind of thing only seasoned pilots might notice. A flutter in the controls, a sensation too fleeting for an alarm to capture. Then the aircraft lurched violently. A deafening bang erupted from the left side of the aircraft, followed by a sudden, gut-wrenching yaw. Inside the cockpit, warning chimes blared, filling the confined space with an orchestra of electronic panic. "Engine failure number 1, Sullivan shouted, his voice spiking with urgency. Reeves barely had time to process the alert before another shockwave rippled through the fuselage. The aircraft pitched aggressively to the left, its wing dipping dangerously close to the dark waters of the San Francisco Bay. In the cabin, passengers screamed as the sudden tilt sent drinks flying and luggage bins rattling. The overhead lights flickered, casting erratic shadows over terrified faces. A baby's wail cut through the chaos, a chilling counterpoint to the mechanical alarms. "God, hold it, hold it." Sullivan gripped his yoke, his knuckles white. Reeves fought the controls. With everything he had, the plane was still climbing, but barely. The left wing refused to rise, dragging the aircraft into a deadly asymmetry. The only thing keeping them from rolling uncontrollably was his brute force on the controls. "Shutting down Engine 1, Sullivan," called, his hands darting to the overhead panel. He flipped the switch, cutting fuel to the damaged engine. The left side of the aircraft shuddered as the power imbalance worsened. The control tower's voice crackled in their earpieces. "United 262, you're banking hard left? Confirm emergency?" "Mayday, Mayday, United 262. Severe engine failure, unable to climb properly, requesting immediate return to SFO." Reeves barked into the radio. "Roger, United 262, maintain heading." "Negative, we are not maintaining heading," Sullivan cut in, the Boeing still veering off course. "We're losing control." A desperate struggle, the aircraft had barely cleared. Icy 500 feet, and every second brought them closer to catastrophe. The city lights below shimmered like distant stars, but Reeves had no time to admire them. He was fighting for their lives. "Flaps to 10, he ordered. Sullivan complied instantly, adjusting the settings to give them as much lift as possible. But it wasn't enough. The aircraft was too heavy, too unbalanced, and rapidly approaching a point of no return. "A flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, trying to maintain composure. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. A sickening jolt cut her off. The aircraft pitched forward, its nose dipping precariously. The airspeed dropped, triggering another warning. The dreaded stall alarm blared, a sound pilots never wanted to hear at low altitude. Come on, come on. Reeves gritted his teeth, fighting to keep the nose up. Sullivan reached for the emergency checklist, flipping pages frantically. We need to dump fuel. We don't have time, Reeves snapped. The altitude tape on the display was plummeting too fast. He had to regain control. Now, then a new idea struck him. It was risky, dangerously so, but they had no other options. We're going, full right rudder and aileron, he said, his voice steel. Sullivan shot him a look. That could send us into a spin. We're already falling. We need to roll her out or we're in the bay. No more hesitation. Reeves slammed the right rudder pedal to the floor while yanking his yoke right. The response was brutal. The aircraft bucked, the right wing dipping sharply before leveling out. The leftward dive slowed. For a breathless moment, neither man spoke. Then, stability. The Boeing 747 leveled, albeit barely, its wounded form shuddering under the strain. The stall warning ceased, replaced by the urgent but comparatively forgiving engine-out alarm. A collective gasp filled the cabin as passengers clung to whatever they could, their faces frozen in terror. But the jet was no longer plummeting. We're climbing, Sullivan whispered, as if saying it aloud would jinx them. Not much, but enough, Reeves muttered, adjusting the trim carefully. Tell ATC we're coming back. Right now. A harrowing return. The air traffic controller's voice wavered as he relayed emergency landing instructions. Every available emergency. Crew at SFO was scrambled, fire trucks lining the runway, their red lights flashing like blood drops against the tarmac. In the cockpit, Reeves and Sullivan worked in tandem, nursing the damaged aircraft back toward the airport. The remaining engines strained under the weight, but the altitude stabilized at 3,000 feet, enough to make a controlled turn back. Flaps 20, Reeves called. Sullivan reached for the lever, his hand steadier now. Flaps 20, set. Gear down. The weed, mechanical whir of the landing gear deploying was an oddly comforting sound. Despite everything, they were going to make it. The runway came into view, a bright beacon against the darkness. One shot at this, Reeves murmured. Nice and easy. The aircraft descended steadily, its approach lined up perfectly. The damaged wing wobbled slightly, but Reeves countered every shift with delicate precision. In the cabin, passengers braced, gripping armrests and each other. The wheels kissed the runway with a firm thud. The thrust reversers roared to life, and the massive jet screeched down the tarmac, decelerating rapidly. A tense silence filled the aircraft until, finally, they rolled to a full stop. The weight of the moment crashed over everyone at once. Ripple of cheers erupted, some passengers openly weeping. In the cockpit, Reeves exhaled shakily, running a hand through his sweat-drenched hair. That, Sullivan panted, was way too close. Yeah, Reeves agreed, finally allowing himself to breathe. But we made it. Outside, fire trucks swarmed around them, but it no longer mattered. They were on the ground, alive. And tonight, against all odds, United 2622 had defied disaster. The Boeing 747 sat still on the tarmac, its massive frame dwarfed by the fleet of emergency vehicles that had rushed to its aid. Red and white lights flashed in frantic pulses across the fuselage, but inside the cockpit, everything was eerily quiet. The cockpit's overhead panels still glowed with caution alerts, the remnants of their harrowing fight to stay airborne. Captain Daniel Reeves exhaled slowly, his grip still tight on the yoke, as though the plane might try to betray him even now. First Officer Mark Sullivan let out a shuddering breath and leaned back in his seat. Jesus, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought we were done. Reeves didn't respond immediately. His eyes flicked across the instruments one last time, confirming what his gut already knew. They were safe, grounded, alive. "Close call," he finally said, his voice hoarse from shouting over alarms. The radio crackled, cutting through the suffocating silence. "United 262, SFO Emergency Command. Confirm your situation. Do you require evacuation?" Reeves pressed the comm button. "Negative on evacuation. No fire, no structural damage. Stand by for further instructions." His tone was controlled, but exhaustion bled through. Sullivan turned to him. "Passengers?" Reeves nodded. "Let's check on them." He reached for the intercom and pressed the cabin crew channel. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have safely landed back at San Francisco International. I understand this has been an extremely difficult experience, and I appreciate your patience. The emergency teams are assessing the situation, and will begin deplaning as soon as possible. Thank you for your trust." The response wasn't immediate, but a few seconds later, a crackling voice came through. It was Chief Flight Attendant Linda Evans. "Captain, everyone is shaken, but we have no serious injuries. A few passengers in distress, but we're managing. Some people are asking, 'What happened?'" Reeves sighed. "Tell them we'll provide details once we confirm everything. Just keep them calm for now." "Understood," Evans replied. The long walk. Emergency vehicles had formed a perimeter around the plane, their crews standing by, ready for any worst-case scenario. A mobile staircase had been positioned at the forward door, and the first responders were waiting. Reeves unbuckled his harness and finally pushed himself up from his seat. His legs felt like lead. Sullivan followed, and the two stepped out of the cockpit into the dimly lit first-class cabin. The sight that greeted them was a testament to the chaos they had just endured. Some passengers sat motionless, staring at nothing, still processing how close they had come to disaster. Others were whispering frantically to each other, their eyes darting to the cockpit as if trying to read the pilots' faces. A few, still, clutched their armrests, white-knuckled, unable to release their grip. Then a slow ripple of claps began. It started with a few scattered individuals, then spread like a wave until the entire cabin was filled with the sound of grateful, relieved applause. Reeves hesitated, caught off guard by the emotion in the air. He was used to gratitude after a smooth landing, but this? This was different. A middle-aged man in business attire, his face pale but resolute, stood up near the front row. "Captain," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "I don't know what happened up there, but thank you. You saved all of us." A woman, holding a toddler close to her chest, nodded tearfully. "I thought—" She choked on the words. "I thought we were going into the ocean. I don't know how you did it, but thank you." Reeves swallowed past the lump in his throat. "We just did our job," he said simply, "and I'm glad you're all safe." The clapping continued as he and Sullivan made their way toward the open door, where a paramedic was waiting. "Captain Reeves, First Officer Sullivan." The paramedic, a tall woman with sharp eyes, scanned them both quickly. "Are either of you injured?" Reeves shook his head. "Just a little shaken up." "Good," she said. "Because airport security and NTSB, investigators are already on their way. You're going to have a long night ahead of you. The investigation begins." They were led down the staircase, past the still-smoking left engine, where mechanics were already swarming, trying to determine what had gone wrong. The acrid smell of burnt fuel and scorched metal filled the air. An NTSB official in a dark blue windbreaker approached, holding a notepad. "Captain Reeves, First Officer Sullivan," he greeted them briskly. "I'm James Callahan, lead investigator for tonight's incident. First, let me say I'm glad you two made it back in one piece. Now, let's talk about what the hell happened. Up there," Reeves exhaled. "Loss of the number one engine immediately after takeoff. Severe yaw, possible compressor stall. It nearly took us down." Callahan scribbled notes, nodding. Did you see or hear anything before the failure? Any warning indications? Sullivan jumped in. There was a slight vibration before takeoff. It wasn't enough to trigger any alarms, but I noticed it in my feet. Then, after rotation, bam! Sudden explosion, massive loss of thrust. Callahan frowned. Bird strike, mechanical failure? Reeves shook his head. Can't say for sure. We were too busy trying to keep the plane in, the air. But something wasn't right. The plane felt wrong before we even lifted off, like it was dragging. A sudden voice cut in from behind them. Captain Reeves. They turned to see a young airline representative, her face tense. Sir, we have a situation. A passenger is refusing to leave the aircraft. He's demanding to speak to you personally. Reeves raised an eyebrow. Who is it? She glanced down at her clipboard. A Mr. Alan DeWitt. He was seated in business class. Reeves and Sullivan exchanged looks. Without a word, they followed her back up the staircase. A mysterious passenger. Inside the cabin, most of the passengers had disembarked, but near the front, a man in his late 50s remained seated, his arms crossed tightly. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Reeves the moment he stepped into view. "You're the captain?" DeWitt asked. "That's right," Reeves said carefully. "I understand you wanted to speak with me." DeWitt stood slowly, his gaze never wavering. "I know what happened. Up there wasn't just an accident," he said quietly. "I saw something before we took off." Reeves stiffened. "What did you see?" DeWitt glanced toward the empty seats as if making sure no one else was listening. "I was looking out the window while we were taxiing. I saw a maintenance truck near the left wing, unmarked, not United's crew. 2 men got out, one of them carrying a small case. They were working near the engine for less than a minute. Then they left. Fast." Reeves felt a chill run through him. "You're sure about this?" DeWitt nodded. "I fly all the time. I know what normal ground crew looks like. This wasn't normal." Sullivan exhaled sharply. "You think someone tampered with the engine?" DeWitt met Reeves's gaze. "I don't think. I know." A heavy silence fell over them. Reeves turned to Callahan, who had followed them up. "Get security on this. Now." Callahan didn't hesitate. He pulled out his radio, barking orders. Within seconds, airport police were moving. Reeves looked back at DeWitt. "You might have just changed everything." DeWitt nodded. "I sure as hell hope so." As security swarmed the aircraft, Reeves felt the weight of the night settle on his shoulders. What had started as a mechanical emergency had just turned into something much, much bigger, and this was far from over.